let's start with a kind of a broader perspective on this idea as it's kind of evolved through the conversation. And I like to talk about the three ages of sustainability. Yeah, and the beginning of the idea can be traced back to the 60s and 70s, when in the post-World War II economy of Europe and North America, you saw this kind of rapid expansion of the industrial complex. The West, so to speak, was developing very quickly. There was a lot of technological advancement, and the capacity for mass production of goods and services was phenomenal. It was just changing lives everywhere. But as a result of this kind of exponential growth of consumer goods and the availability of mass-produced food and technologies, we began to hear warning signs of what was happening as a consequence of this scale of production. So much like what had happened during the first Industrial Revolution, which led to the birth of modernism in architecture, which was a reaction to the kind of the ills, shall we say, of the industrial complex, the industrial city. The second Industrial Revolution, which was happening in this post-war period, was also giving birth to a lot of conversation about, hang on, what are we doing to the world around us? Now, the distinguishing feature here was that what was happening in this period had impact that went beyond geographical boundaries. So it was no longer a case of like, there's a factory and the people next to the factory suffer as a consequence of pollution. But the production, the sourcing of materials and all of that was coming from places that were much, much further away. So the ripple effect of this industrial economy was being felt very far away. And so there were a couple of books that came out which we look back at as being kind of seminal texts in this field. One of them is Silent Spring by Rachel Carlson, 1962, in which she critiqued the indiscriminate use of pesticides in farming, for example, and the impact that had on health that went beyond the farming communities. In 72, there was the book Limits of Growth, which was co-authored by Donella Meadows, who's a systems thinker. And it was a report that came out that said that the global system of nature, the planetary systems, could not support the rate of economic and population growth. So per capita consumption combined with population growth was reaching an unsustainable level. At some point there would be collapse, or there would be a tipping point. So this was kind of the beginnings of the sustainability movement, really concerned with how what we were doing as a species was affecting the global planetary system. The second age of sustainability, I would put it somewhere in the 80s and 90s, which was the beginning of neoliberal economic policies. Now, you're probably too young to remember, but you must have heard of Reagan and Thatcher and the whole kind of bottom-up kind of logic of economic growth, of clearing the hurdles to economy and giving people leeway to create capital, to create wealth. This was accompanied by a very rapid period of globalization with the opening up of economies of China and India. And so we became very interested in the idea of how do we do all of this, generate all this wealth, this good life, but to do it within the limits of nature. And so the book that had come out before, The Limits of Growth, was influential in shaping the discussion of, we've got to have all this. And this is round about the time of the Brundtland Report, which defines sustainability as what you consume now relative to future generations, that famous textbook definition. It was really a way of saying that we can take, but we have to take judiciously. We have to take it in a very measured way. And so we saw the birth of a lot of indicators of sustainability, of eco-efficiency, The metric of ecological footprint, for example, came out of this period. So the idea was that, well, if you can just calculate all of this, put it on a spreadsheet, the input, the output, like let's kind of create a balance like it was a mathematical proposition. Yeah. Of course, we know that it's not that simple. Yeah. And many of these metrics could not easily be translated to action on the drawing board. So if you were designing a building or if you were designing a neighborhood and you had to figure out the ecological footprint of everything, you were in trouble because it wasn't that easy and there wasn't enough data. I think we were quite undeterred by the fact that we couldn't figure it out. And so we went on to what I consider to be perhaps the most detrimental idea relating to sustainability, which is the idea of profitable sustainability. By the year 2000, we saw the birth of the green building movement, and I'm going to shift gears to talking about my industry, the building and construction industry. And the idea that was being promoted was that green is good for business, that if you waste less, you have more profit, if you have better health for people in these buildings, well, then you have better productivity. Everything had an economic value attached to it. And green was basically a way of making more money. I feel this was incredibly detrimental because it took our eyes off the ball. And the thing that we started with was our relationship to nature, to planetary systems. And suddenly we were looking at this as a business proposition. And I think it really distracted us, in my opinion. And to give you an example of this, and I speak in the context of Asia, if you look at what was happening, say, in Asian cities at the time. Mumbai in India has, for example, been called the greenest city in India. Why? Because it has 750 green certified buildings, the largest number of green certified buildings in India. And so what was happening while these green buildings were being built between 1972 and 2011, the built-up area of the city increased by 450%. So the growth of the city was phenomenal. There was mass influx of migrant labor. The economy was booming. In the process, 37% of forest and green cover was cut down. Water bodies shrank by 12%. Wetlands went down by 32%. The population in slums rose to 9 million, or 62% of metropolitan area. Yeah. All of this couldn't be swept under the rug. By 2005, Mumbai was hit with a massive flood. It was unlike anything seen. It paralyzed the city. Something like 14,000 homes were destroyed. Over 1,500 people lost their lives. And all of this, when they got down to looking at the cause of the failure of the hydrological system of the city, could be traced to what had been done to the ecological systems of the city since it began to develop rapidly. Now, I say Mumbai, but Mumbai is by far not unique. There were many cities that were going through that. Bandung, for example, in Indonesia. It's the second largest city in Indonesia. Between 1983 and 2002, the footprint of the city tripled in that very short space of time. The forest cover was halved. There was not enough infrastructure to deal with waste and fresh water demand. So what do people do? Well, they extract water from the ground. And so the number of boreholes that people dug, the wells for extracting groundwater, increased to about 2,500. The water table in Bandung dropped by 2 meters. 2 meters. The water table dropped. Yeah. And this led to land subsidence in many areas across the city. In that same period, industrial capacity increased by 100-fold. The river that runs through the city today is considered one of the most polluted in the world. The fecal coliform levels in this river are 5,000 times higher than what is permitted by code. So we're not getting away with it. We're not destroying ecology or replacing it with profit-making businesses at no cost. It's coming back to bite us, at some point along the way. Unfortunately, the poor are most affected. When you have these kinds of floods or you have polluted waters, it's often the poor that suffer the most. So that poses a second condition, dynamic to the situation. So I end off by talking about the third age, and I would say that this is not defined yet. It is emerging. We are there now. We are now at the beginning of this. And this is us returning to the idea of human-nature partnerships. So we start by asking, how do we protect what is existing? How do we repair and restore what has been lost or degraded? How do we create new systems, whether they're buildings or parks or neighborhoods, that mimic nature, that generate resources and sustain capacities through the act of design? So